they will hold that moisture in there. And if you're not doing a lot with intentional plantings of vegetables and stuff, there are actually a great many native wildflowers that are better adapted for growing in gravel than just dirt. And that gravel provides the best place for them to germinate and thrive. Things like the gold poppies, lupin germinates better in gravel than pretty much anywhere else. My best lupin patch is in my gravel driveway. Wood chips. Wood chips are pretty affordable and easy to find. You can sometimes get the chip drop, and that's inexpensive. Wood chips are nice because they will eventually break down, and they can also double with holding the weeds down. You want to make sure that they're well broken down before you incorporate them into the soil, but they will do pretty much everything that the gravel does and add organic matter. Straw also is good. It breaks down faster, and so usually at the end of a season, the straw can actually be incorporated into the soil without too much danger. The problem with trying to mix it into the soil too soon is that the same microbes in the soil that break down the organic matter want nitrogen. So they're competing for the nitrogen that your plants are competing for. And so sometimes if there's too much organics that aren't well broken down, you can end up having plants that are chlorotic. So my usual tactic is in the winter, I don't put mulch on my beds. I save all the mulch, all the compost that I'm making for the whole winter, and I use that in the summer to mulch my summer things like tomatoes and beans and eggplant and so on, so that in the summer it has the protection and that mulch continues to break down, and then in winter, before I start planting the winter things, then I stir it into the soil.
I have a question, Lorien. So when you use your compost, how thick do you put it on typically around the plant?
Probably, repeat the question. The question is, how thick do I put the compost on? And it's pretty much 3 to 4 inches is ideal. If it's a sturdy plant like tomatoes or eggplant, I may actually do it even deeper. If it's something that's just getting established, like a row of beans just coming up, I may put it on thinner, or I may opt to use something like straw that it can kind of come up through. And related to straw are other things from the garden. So usually in the late spring, I will have all the pea vines. Those make beautiful mulch, and they break down nice and fast, and they contain nitrogen, which also improves the soil. The fava bean vines, when I have garbanzo beans, I didn't grow them this year, but there's lots and lots of winter things that can just be laid out as mulch as you're transitioning to the summer. And then with the compost, I'm incorporating all of my chicken manure into it, and then all of my kitchen scraps. Even bones. Bones contain phosphorus, which it takes a long time for it to break down, but phosphorus promotes fruiting and flowering in plants. And most of your summer things are things where you want the fruits and the flowers. You need flowers to make tomatoes, you need flowers to make eggplant, you need flowers to make all those kinds of things. And so if your compost is big enough that you can handle bones without it getting smelly, bones are fantastic. Let's see, moving on from mulch. Sometimes I will plant a bed thickly with a crop rather than mulching it. This can be a cover crop. Question?
We have a question before you move on to cover crops. 3 to 4 inches with gravel mulch as well as organic. Do you recommend 3 to 4 inches of gravel? Less gravel.
If it's going to be, so the question is how much gravel mulch? If it's going to be a path, yes, 3 or 4 inches of gravel is good. More is better. You have to be careful about pea gravel because it can be slippery if it's deep. But if you're using decomposed granite or a chipped gravel, then it can be equally deep. Okay, cover crops. So a cover crop is really any crop that will completely cover an area and shade it. Sometimes they will be tilled in after they've come up just a little bit. This is not usually something that home gardeners do, but you can do it. It's a good technique if you get overrun with weeds. Plant something like small grains or clover or buckwheat. Let it grow up a few inches and then turn it in either by digging or by tilling. And any of the weed seeds that come up simultaneously with it will be destroyed before they have a chance to make seed and reproduce. And so by doing that, you're breaking that weed cycle, which is a good thing to do both winter and summer. And then if that cover crop is a legume like clover, you're also taking the nitrogen that it has fixed and adding that into your soil. So in all seasons, I'm trying to change where I'm growing my legumes like peas and beans and so on to try and keep moving that nitrogen fixation around the garden. There are many kinds of beans that work really well for cover crops. I've used peppery beans, I've used lima beans, I've used black-eyed peas. These are all things that will sprawl. They're nice and leafy. Many of them are more resilient to the drought than other kinds of things. So they make really good summer cover crops. Pseudo cereals like amaranth, things like sesame. Sesame grows densely and tall, so it also helps to shade out any weeds. It shades the soil. It keeps the sun from beating on the soil. There's a number of flowers. Pictured are zinnias. Zinnias are fun. They're not necessarily a vegetable crop, but they're also a great pollinator plant. And of course, having pollinator plants in the garden year round is a really powerful thing. If you're struggling to get your tomatoes pollinated, zinnias are fantastic. Sunflowers are fantastic. The sesame also does that. There's just a lot of different choices. Your vegetable garden can be pretty too. And Sesame produces a surprising amount of seed for just a small space. I think everybody should try it. Sweet potatoes.
How far away can you plant flowers from your vegetable garden to be effective?
The question is, how far away can you plant the flowers from the vegetable garden? Pretty much in our city lots, anywhere in your lot is going to help, because the bees can fly to 2 miles to try and find their forage. And so if they're going 2 miles and they find your yard, they're going to find your whole yard. Another thing that's really helpful for the bees, I frequently see the bees on my drip irrigation, because water in the summer is a really, really important thing. And so if you have some kind of irrigation, some kind of water available, the bees are going to come. They use the water to fan the hives. They take the water back and use their wings to create an evaporative cooling effect. So sweet potatoes, if you haven't grown sweet potatoes, they can cover a lot of ground and they thrive in the heat and they give a great crop in the summer. Squash, most of the sprawling squash will cover the ground really nicely. And then another native that is both edible and ornamental is the devil's claw, which the young pods can be eaten like okra when they're about 2 to 3 inches long. They're pretty tasty. And then when they're mature, the seeds can be eaten like sesame seeds. The question is, was that the devil's claw? Yes, the devil's claw, like the one that they use for the native basketry. Moving on from cover crops to shade. So cover crops are a way of shading the ground with things that are mostly fairly short. But there's also times when larger shade is more appropriate. Trees are fabulous if you got them. It can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes because their roots will compete. But usually you can figure a way around that. It's kind of the right distance, and usually kind of around the drip line is about the right place to give you the most optimal shade for most vegetable plants. Because most trees will have their roots out to the drip line. So if you're just past the drip line, you're going to be past the worst of the roots, but you're still going to benefit from the shade both to the soil and to the plants. Shade structures are useful. You can put them where you need them, regardless of what's growing in your yard. Using the buildings that already exist, fences, buildings, houses, make use of that shade as much as you can, and pay attention to whether it's the morning or the afternoon sun. I'm jumping forward a line, but each one will be different for different kinds of plants. Most of the vegetable plants really like morning sunshine and can benefit from afternoon shade to take the edge off that afternoon heat. But again, most of the summer vegetables can take a lot more sun than people realize. I never shade my tomatoes. I never shade my okra. I never shade my sweet potatoes or my sesame. We'll talk more about that under the individual plants. But Another thing that you can do is fast growing plants. Things like okra, things like sesame, they all can get fairly tall. If you're trellising your tomatoes, they can get nice and tall. So I will do a row of tomatoes and then a row of something smaller like beans, and then a row of okra, and then a row of something short like cucumbers, and then maybe a row of another row of tomatoes. Sorry, brain. But by using the different characteristics of the plants, you can use the plants themselves to help provide the shade. And it also, tall plants will make humidity that can also benefit the other plants, cooling it through the evaporative cooling. It's called transpiration, and it's a great way to modify the garden. So you've got big trees, shorter shrubs, and plants like okra and tomatoes, and then you've got the shorter things. And by alternating those, you're creating a much more diverse climate in your garden, a more diverse group of microclimates in your garden. Okay, any further questions about shade before I move on? The question sort of is, what do you do with a big tree where you have mostly shade? And there are a few plants that can do well in the summer with that shade. In the winter, it's nice because the mesquite tree will be deciduous and it will give you more light in the winter and increase the number of things that you can grow. So watering is probably the biggest key thing in the summer. And there's a lot to talk about with watering. First of all, deep watering. You want those plants to get their roots deep. And so when you plant them, you don't need to water them much deeper than what they're planted at first, but you quickly want to start making sure that the water is reaching lower and lower. The roots can't go down into dry soil. They have to go into wet soil. And with that said, the deeper the water is, the less it's going to evaporate. And so if you can get that water down deep and those roots down deep, the plant is going to be more resilient no matter how hot it gets. So the question is it better to flood the garden? One of the techniques that I do use drip irrigation, but I let it, all of my beds are what's called passive rainwater irrigation. So they're lower, they're not raised beds, they're lower than the main soil surface, which means anytime that it rains, the water flows into that. Well, then along that, I have the lines with my drip irrigation in it. So when we don't have rain and I'm just watering with the irrigation, I let it fill up like a puddle. And then even in the deep summer, once the plants are well established, I'm not watering my tomatoes or my eggplants more than usually 3 days. If we have an exceptionally hot, dry spell, I might do every other day, but I'm usually doing 3 days between waterings. Now that will change depending on what soil you have. If you have a really good clay soil like I have, that clay soil holds the water. The more organic matter you have in the soil, the better the water will be held. And then Did you have a question? The the deeper the water goes, the better it will be held. So deep watering, the humidity matters, and so we kind of have two parts to our summer. We have dry summer and we have wet summer. And in the monsoon, you have to be aware of the change between that. Once we get into the monsoons, even if we don't actually have rain, because of the higher humidity, the soil is not going to dry out as fast. And this makes it really important, not just to water deeply enough, but to check the soil before you water. Using a soil probe will tell you how deep you're going. Feeling the soil under the mulch will tell you what it's doing at the surface. And especially if you're growing in containers or raised beds, you want to feel the soil. If it's a small container, pick it up and see how heavy it is. If it's a bigger container, see how long it takes for the water to run out the bottom. But one of the things about the monsoon is you can actually get into trouble with overwatering instead of underwatering because the water isn't evaporating, and the symptoms can look identical, because what happens when you overwater is the roots are damaged by the root rot, and the plant can no longer take the water up through the roots, and so it starts to wilt much more dramatically and doesn't recover when you water. And so it can be really hard to tell, which is why it's, if I'm in doubt, I will stick my hands in that soil. I will use a probe to see how deep it is. If you're away, this is hard. You'll probably want to make sure that you have somebody checking it, because the other thing about being away is if it fails and you have things that you're hoping to keep alive, then they will die. But in general, in the summer, in the vegetable garden, if there's an area that I'm not planting, I don't water it. It seems kind of harsh. It will dry out pretty thoroughly, but the nice thing about most microbes and most of the other kinds of microorganisms, especially if they're the ones that are adapted for this climate, is they can take the drought, they can survive quite extreme conditions and recover. And if they don't recover, you can always transplant some nice moist soil from another part of your yard and mix it in. And microbes reproduce exponentially. So once you start watering again, those kinds of things will recover remarkably quickly. And then another thing about watering and knowing when to water is to pay attention really well to the plants, really observing and knowing the plants. And not all plants behave the same. A lot of people will get really worried when they go out in the afternoon and they see their squash or their melons or their cucumbers wilting. But it's actually an adaptation to the heat. It's natural for most of the plants in that family to wilt when it's hot and then recover overnight. But the next morning, if it's not recovered, you probably need to check your soil and see if there's a problem, or check your plant and see if you have pests like vine borers. But that afternoon wilt, it's most dramatic in the squash family, but you can observe it in some other plants as well. And so don't freak out, check the soil. I just can't emphasize that enough. Related to that, some of the things that we discussed as cover crops, the beans, particularly the tepary beans. If you're using those, once they are up, really pay attention. Beans will usually draw their leaves kind of up and closed during the day and then open them out at night. And you can tell after a few days when it's starting to hit that point of needing to be watered. And in my garden, when I'm doing a big bed of tepary beans, after about the first 2 weeks, there have been times when it has taken 9 days before I need to do a deep watering again. They are that drought tolerant. And so if you're doing something like that, that's a native or a really drought tolerant plant, really taper the water off as time goes on. So when those leaves close up and don't reopen, it's that daily closing and reopening that really tells you. So if you go out in the early morning and they're still looking closed up and like they're dry, then it's time to water. Peppery beans can produce seed on 3 deep rainfall events. They're amazing. If you haven't tried growing them, I highly recommend them. Okay, so any last questions about water? The question is the best time of day to do deep watering. So best time of day to do deep watering is when you can do the deep watering. I have so much to do watering that I'm watering basically all day in the summer, some part of the garden. That said, yes, the evening and the early morning are really good times. The early morning, because that's when you can see, did it recover overnight? The evening, because it's not going to be the hot part of the day. But if you go out there in the hot part of the day and you feel around in your soil and you realize that you've made a mistake and forgotten something, by all means, water it. Don't wait just because of the time of day. Okay, and that brings us to the things that are my favorite for plant choices. This is a huge list, but it's fun. So for drought tolerance, I've talked already about tepary beans. They're fabulous. They're delicious. They make really good soup. They're beautiful plants. So they're definitely a favorite. Amaranth, both the wild green ones and the colored ones, fun, beautiful. The young leaves are delicious. The seeds are edible, and they're a fantastic pollinator plant. Chiltepine, there's a good one for shade. And I have chiltepine plants that survive from year to year in shade with really no particular effort. They will do better with some water, but they will survive with very, very, very little. Yes, they are very spicy. The devil's claw, that's another really good one for drought tolerance. They often come up on their own in parts of my garden where I'm not actually actively irrigating. And then purslane. You may not have intentionally grown purslane, but it's a great plant. If you get it coming up as a weed, treasure it. It makes a beautiful mat forming ground cover, cover crop. If I don't get all of my beds mulched, I will leave the purslane there and it will act like a mulch around my tomatoes and peppers and also give me nourishing, delicious greens for months. I just keep going, I cut it, I don't pull it to harvest it. Very good in salads, very good in soups, very good in omelets. Pretty much anything you can do with any other green, you can do with purslane. Heat tolerance. Most of your beans, but not your string beans. So lima beans, cowpeas, tepary beans, black-eyed peas, those are all really good. Walking onions are nice. They're dormant in the winter and active in the summer, as opposed to most of the other onions. The bulbing onions grow through the winter and you harvest them before it gets hot, or the toys, which just go dormant for the heat. Amaranth, sunflower, we've talked a little bit about. Sunchokes. And sunchokes are another one of those wonderful, heat tolerant, easy to grow things that will make you fast shade. They'll get 8 to 10 feet tall, have beautiful flowers, just like a sunflower, but a little bit smaller, because technically they are sunflowers. And then in the fall, after the first frost, you dig up the delicious roots and you cook and eat them like potatoes, or you eat them raw like jicama. We talked about them a bit in the last time I spoke here when I talked about root vegetables. Gourds, melons, Armenian cucumber, not regular cucumber. Regular cucumbers like it cooler. They like the spring and the fall, but not the summer. But Armenian cucumbers are technically melons, and so they like the heat. And the really viney squash and things like the Armenian cucumbers, you can grow on a trellis and then they can make shade. Or you can grow them on the ground and they can be a cover crop. Squash, loofahs, some tomatoes. You have to be careful with tomatoes and look for varieties that are heat tolerant, but many will do well in the heat. Peppers, eggplant. Peppers are another one that they can take the heat, but they need a little shade to really thrive. Tomatillos, sweet potato we talked about. Sweet potato loves the heat. And I've had sweet potatoes survive transplanting in like July with no shade, just from slips, not rooted in a pot, but just a slip with a few little roots on it stuck into the ground in full sun in July. Devil's claw we've talked about. Okra loves the heat, loves the sun. Basil, Malabar spinach. Malabar spinach is another one of yours for shade. So if you have shade, it will really thrive in the shade. The Malakia, the Egyptian spinach, is in the hibiscus family and is a good leafy green for the summer, New Zealand spinach, and then most of your herbs, rosemary, chives, sage, thyme, these are all good in the heat. A lot of people think, oh, herbs are going to need the shade. No, most of the standard herbs that you're familiar with are native to the Mediterranean, the sunny Mediterranean. What do we have in common? Sun and heat. They love it here. Like other things, they're going to appreciate deep watering though. And they're really resentful of overwatering, especially the sage and the rosemary. So there's a few things that are kind of special for our area, and that's things that are adapted to the monsoons. Tepary beans are good that way. Like I said, they can produce a crop on 3 summer rains if they're grown in a basin type of a bed. Some kinds of corn, the native corns, are adapted here. You have to be careful. The hybrid corns often will have problems with pollination during the high heat. Some tomatoes, there are some tomatoes that thrive best on dry heat and others that will do better in moist heat. And then another tactic with tomatoes, this isn't quite a monsoon adaptation, but very often tomatoes will grow through the heat but not bloom and set fruit because of the heat. The pollen gets killed. But at the start of the monsoon, if you cut the tomato vines back, you can rejuvenate the plant because they will really appreciate all that rainwater and start really growing vegetatively. Question?
I have to repeat for me because I have the mic. We have a couple of questions. What is the plant in the photo?
The plant in the photo is sesame.
Okay.
And they grow about 6 feet tall, and they have beautiful blossoms that look like foxgloves.
Okay. And then do you have varieties of tomatoes you suggest?
Favorites for me are Punta Banda, Nichols Heirloom, Super Sioux. Let's see. Most of the cherry tomatoes do pretty well. Yellow pear is always a favorite of mine. Let's see. Yeah, those are probably the first ones I go to. But yeah, if you rejuvenate the tomatoes, I don't know the answer to that. The question is, is the sesame edible in any other part besides the seed? The whole plant smells kind of like sesame. So it's really a pleasant experience to walk through it. They really are beautiful, and you plant them densely and they grow up tall. And then if you don't get them harvested, things like the goldfinches will come and find them, and it's just a really beautiful thing. But getting back to the tomatoes, if you rejuvenate them, then they will be prepared to start blooming as it begins to cool down in September and October. And so you get a nice crop in the fall. And then a nice surprise monsoon one is Iitoi's onions. Iitoi's onions are one of our native adapted varieties that's been grown in Tucson for hundreds of years. And although they will go completely dormant during the dry part of summer, if we get good monsoons, they will usually send up beautiful new leaves that you can harvest and eat like chives at that point. The bulb doesn't usually form until after it's grown through the winter, but the tops are just delicious. Yeah, so those are the special monsoon adaptations. So there's a few things that do a summer dormancy, like the Itoi's onions, and then tomatoes do that semi-dormant kind of a thing where they stop blooming and fruiting, but then will be rejuvenated for the fall. But another one that goes dormant in the summer are artichokes. So if you've ever planted artichokes and you harvest some in the spring and then the plant looks like it's dying, it's not. Water it, not as much, but make sure that it keeps getting some water through the summer and it will live fully dormant. It will look completely dead. It will look horrible. So make sure it's planted somewhere where you don't have to like show it off to the neighbors, but it will come back in the fall. And I've had some live to be 5 or 6 years old. The more years they live, the more artichokes they make. So another thing to influence your choice of plants for the summer is things that have deep roots, because like I mentioned over and over, deep watering makes for water that doesn't evaporate and plants that are much more resilient. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillos, sorghum, that's another one that hasn't come up yet. Corn, if you're using one of the heat tolerant varieties, corn roots can get down 6 to 8 feet if your water goes that far. Tomatoes can get 4 to 5 feet. Peppers and eggplant can get 3 to 4 feet deep. Okra, 3 to 4 feet deep. Sunchokes, 3 to 4 feet deep. Sunflowers, 3 to 4 feet deep. They can't get there unless the water is going there. And here's a little tidbit about sunflowers. Sunflowers will also keep the weeds down because they produce a chemical that reduces the germination of seeds. So if you've got a place where you want to keep weeds out of, plant some sunflowers. That'll help keep the weeds down. And then the last, oh.
I have a corn question. So I have grown tons of corn and I've only had good pollination a few times from the only one I've ever really successfully grown is like glass gem corn, which is beautiful. But I was told you need to plant like at least 40 corn plants in order to get decent pollination. Is that true or am I being mythed?
No, that's absolutely true.
Okay, because that was
The
my
more-
plan.
The more plants that you can plant, and don't plant them all strung out in a row, plant them in a block,
Like a grid.
like a grid.
Okay.
And if you're hoping to save seed grow again, you actually need to have at least 200 individuals in order to prevent inbreeding depression.
Wow.
200 individuals, and you need to be able to save seed from at least 50 of those.
Wow.
It's a lot. It's a lot of plants. It's kind of intimidating. But if you're just growing it to eat, that's less crucial. But the pollination is still going to be plant in blocks and plant like 40 to 50 plants.
Thanks.
Some other things to think about with corn are the wind direction. Make sure that, so in the summer, the wind starts to come from the east predominantly. So make sure that the wind, they're wind pollinated, so that the wind is going to carry the pollen through and not carry it away.
Yeah, okay, that makes total sense. And I was growing mine by a wall, so it probably wasn't even getting as much wind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, so the last thing on the plant choice list is local adaptations. This is really cool because we live in this wonderful place where people have been growing crops for thousands of years. And so explore the native varieties. There are some really wonderful squash varieties, really wonderful chilies and corn, the peppery beans. These are fantastic plants. They are adapted for here. They have been grown here. They were made for here. After that, varieties from places with similar climates. So Africa has a number, parts of Asia, the things like sesame, like sorghum, like millet. These are all things that are well adapted because they're from similar climates. And it's fun to explore the world through food. So do definitely try it. And then the last kind of thing is if you're saving seed from your plants, then you are building the adaptation to this climate. Whatever kind of plant it is, if you're choosing the plants that survive the heat here, you're going to have more success with the plants that you grow in the summer. Question?
Okay, I have a few more online questions. Is that a white or a black sesame?
That is a white sesame.
Okay, before they ask, is there a different color flower on the black sesame? Color of the flower?
I
or-
can't answer that. I have not grown it.
These are pink, right? Lorien?
Yeah.
The ones on the black sesame are yellow.
Whoa.
Yeah. And also you can eat sesame leaves. I just looked it up and they're very popular in Asian and Korean dishes.
Huh. Well, I'll have something new to try.
Okay, and then this is a little bit more complicated. Somebody's asking regarding gravel on soil. My most recent compost had gravel in it and I just left it in. My root crops, example would be, and I'm going to slaughter this word, the daikon radishes were stubby and deformed. Hang on. Reading said this will happen if there are stones in the soil, so it should be well sifted. So I guess they're asking more about gravel on soil for mulch relative to root crops. I mean, my thought would be if you're growing root crops, don't use gravel, but go ahead
So-
and answer that.
Yeah, I've grown root crops in soil that has gravel, and yes, it will deform the roots, especially if there's a high proportion of gravel. The more that you mix the soil and blend the soil, you can usually reduce the amount of gravel to soil over time. But if it's still really high, then it's probably not the optimum place to plant root crops. One of the other similar problems that I've had with root crops is my soil is very heavy clay. And before I started growing in it, there were many, many places where it was very packed in. And the first few times of planting, the soil wasn't all that deep. I had carrots that went down like this far and then turned sideways. So yes, the hardness of the soil, the number of rocks, the size of the rocks can all make an impact on root crops. So the question is, will sandy soil be better for carrots? Sandy soil is certainly easier for growing a long carrot. I usually choose carrot varieties that are fairly short because of the clay soil, but carrots actually like clay soil. I grow fantastic carrots, even though it's thick clay soil. I have to make sure I water it really well before I harvest, or they just break. But they actually like clay soil. The question is about how to do Three Sisters planting. I haven't done it myself, but it is a very effective thing. Big thing that you want to make sure is that the don't overrun corn too quickly. Yes, they're very well adapted to grow together. I can't totally answer that, and I think that it depends on the variety and the climate. Here, because our climate is so extreme, and many of the corn varieties that are native here are shorter, I might be inclined to plant the corn first and then follow up with the beans and the squash.
What can you tell us about containers versus like proper soil?
So the question is about containers, and containers are hard in the summer because they do dry out much more rapidly. I find that the bigger the container is, the easier it is to keep it watered properly. A lot of what I do, I'm growing plant starts to sell at the farmer's market. So the small pots like this, in the heat of summer, I'm probably watering twice a day. The 1 gallon pots, I'm probably watering at least once a day. If we have a real extreme heat wave during the dry part of summer, I will check them again a second time to see if they need to be watered. Pots that are like 3 to 5 gallons are probably going to be okay with once a day, depending on what's in them. Some plants utilize water faster than other plants. So succulents and cactus, you're probably going to want to check them and water them less frequently than, say, tomatoes or basil. Some of the same rules apply. Still pay attention to the condition of the plant, how fast it wilts, how fast it recovers from wilting. And plants, if they do get fully, or containers, if they do get fully dried out, it can be really hard to rehydrate them. And so you may need to water it and then in a few minutes come back and water it some more to make sure that the water is penetrating all the way into the potting mix. A lot of those potting mixes will become hydrophobic if they dry out completely. And it can be hard to tell. You'll water it and you'll think, oh, the water's coming out the bottom. It's fine. Well, if the water is just going along the inside of the pot, because that's another thing, the soil will shrink and then there's a gap between the soil and the pot. So the water just flows right through without wetting the soil. If it's not too big a pot, picking it up and lifting it, you can usually tell the difference between whether it's heavy or light. And yeah, container watering is definitely more challenging, and you'll have to be paying much closer attention than doing things in the ground.
How do we visit your farm?
So every Wednesday night, I have my farm stand, and if I'm not too busy, I'm happy to give people tours. It's Wednesday evenings right now, 4:30 to 5:30, but as it gets warmer, that will get later and later. I usually try to do like the last hour before sunset. And I'm near Country Club in Glen. I every Wednesday night put out signs on Glen at Glen and Edith and by the alley so that you can find your way to where I set up my little table with produce. Another way to get in touch with me is to message me on Facebook or email me, and we can make an appointment for you to come visit the farm. And I also do work parties Saturday mornings, most Saturdays. Check on Facebook to see if I've listed a work party. I'm trying to post what we're going to be doing so that people can decide if they want to come and join. And like I said at the very beginning, if you come help out in the garden, you go home with goodies.
I'm going to add into that. If you look her up on Facebook, it's Dreamflower Garden. Dreamflower. Do not use two words. She will not come up. Not sure what this person is asking here. Will the water in the soil rise? I think.
So water is subject to gravity. It sinks. There is some capillary action that can sometimes happen if the soil has enough organics and enough clay, where if there's water in the soil and there's pressure from above, it can create a way for water to come up. But that's not something that you're going to be able to really make advantage of here. Because it requires you not to walk on the soil most of the time. You have to be, if you're going to use those kinds of techniques, that's a whole nother topic. But yeah, the water stays down there. So if you water past the root zone, it will keep going down and eventually end up in the aquifer. So it won't be wasted. But that's part of why they've been trying to build the rainwater basins along like Glen and some of the other roads, is because if you trap that, if you infiltrate it, you actually put it back into the aquifer.
More questions? Anybody? That is that it, Lorien?
That's what I have.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
From the local, the seed library, with various branches
I mean, if you find